the Diary of a CTO podcast, sharing the secrets of successful CTOs. Brought to you by True North, the home of technology recruitment. Hosted by Guy Bevington.
Great. So welcome back to the Diary of a CTO, where I'm delighted to be joined by this week's guest, Meri Williams. Meri, happy Friday. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. I'm very well indeed. Thank you. Yeah, looking forward. Got a cheese and wine evening booked in this evening, so looking forward to that. It's keeping me going for the day.
Very nice.
So look, lovely to see you, Meri. Really appreciate your time. So for those who haven't yet had the pleasure of making your acquaintance, you are the CTO of PLEO, which I'm sure is a brand most people are aware of now. But essentially, PLEO is a leading fintech business, building a very innovative platform around payments and spend management, which we actually use as a business. So I know firsthand it's pretty wicked. But prior to PLEO, you've had a highly impressive career as a technologist and leader, taking on some very senior roles for the likes of other huge brands like Procter & Gamble and Marks & Spencer's and Monzo Bank, of course, as well as doing some great work in other fields such as biotech world and the VC world as well. So, you know, a massive amount of experience to bring to the table today. So really glad to have you here and appreciate your time to share your perspective with us on things. So if we're sitting comfortably, let's get going. So it'd be great to find out a little bit more about you, your background, and tell us a little bit about your story really and how you got into tech in the first place.
Sure. So I'm South African originally, and I grew up quite kind of working class. And my first computer I built from broken parts that my dad had picked up at the factory he worked at. And so I started off very much as a hardware hacker, and then moved into software over time. But I was a bit of a polymath growing up. So my decision when I went to university was between computer science, film school, or classics, which is a sort of unusual combo.
Fair play.
But I came to the UK to study, and because I was an overseas student, decided that if I was going to pay 60 grand for a degree, it had better pay off in the end. And so I did computer science at the University of Bath. At the time, it had become the top maths department in the country, had beaten Oxford and Cambridge. And so I went there instead of Cambridge because they'd done so well, but also because they did a year in industry. And so I did a summer internship at Procter & Gamble in my first year of uni. And then basically didn't leave for 10 years. So I did a number of different roles there, some in the UK and some in the sort of global business services area. Everything from acquisition of Weller and Gillette through to running the finance systems for Europe, Middle East and Africa for a while. All sorts. I used to run the biggest SAP install in the world, but I'm okay now is the joke I tend to tell about it. And then I P&G is a fantastic place to grow up. It's a real developer of leaders and a really great business to be a part of. But I realized I was a little far from the real tech. And I was interviewing with Google and Amazon and places like that. And then this guy called Tom Loosemore rang me up and said, "Hey, we're going to fix government. Come help us do that instead." And he then called my friends and made them convince me that I could go to Google anytime, but I could only fix the government once. And so I left P&G and joined the Government Digital Service and built the team that built gov.uk, which is my first big scaling gig. So we went from 30 to 300 people in 9 months, which was intense. Wouldn't do it again. Had 80 direct reports at one point.
Wow.
And then unfortunately, right at the end, I was only at GDS for a year because I got a disability diagnosis. So I took a bit of time off. Then I was at Vodafone for a bit, then did a tiny medtech startup that went horribly wrong. And we stuck together as a team, formed a little product studio called Balloon. And then M&S were our first big customer, and they slowly convinced us to go in-house. So that's how I became M&S.com's CTO. I then went to Moo, then to Monzo, then to Helix to do AI-driven drug discovery. And then, joined PLEO back in November 2022. So just about 2 years ago now. Awesome. And I do a bunch of other stuff on the side. So I'm coming up to my 10th year chairing the Lead Dev Conference, which is a technology leadership conference for eng managers, tech leads. There's also a version for directors and above called Leading Eng. And then I advise Kindred, who are I'm a tech advisor for their funds. They're a VC here in London that practices equitable venture. And these days I'm also on Flagstone's board, who are another fintech that do a savings platform. So helping people get the most out of FSCS protection, but also get the best rates. So yeah.
Fair enough. Very busy then. Lots on your plate by the looks of it.
Yes, I've got ADHD and autism, and it shows in my career.
Well, it sounds a very, very interesting journey. And I love the fact that you started as an intern as well. I think that's really nice that, and clearly, stayed there for a very long period of time. So, must have felt very comfortable and obviously loyal to the brand that took you into the business and trained you up. How'd you sort of feel about that whole internship world?
Oh, I love internships. I remember reading Joel Spolsky, who's the founder of Trello and Fog Creek Software and things like that. I remember him writing many, many years ago when I was still at university about how people think that they're hiring the top 1%, but the real top 1% are often not ever available because they do internships during college and then are not available on the general market because they just roll straight into roles.
Yeah.
And that was definitely what happened to me and what happened to a lot of my colleagues and friends at university, was that we went off to do these years in industry, and then we pretty much had graduate jobs sorted by the end of the internship. So
it
was very, very nice also to not be looking for a job in your final year of uni.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, it's also, I guess it's quite a nice, works on both sides, doesn't it? It's quite a nice try before you buy for both sides of the coin, right? You get to really experience what it's like to be in the business before you kind of fully commit as well.
Yeah, it's great.
Cool. Okay. Well, lovely. Thank you for that. Genuinely very interesting career journey that you've had to date, and clearly working in a wealth of different domains and fields must have amassed a very broad knowledge base as a tech leader. So, talk to us a little bit about then, what do you feel are some of the most valuable qualities and traits that you've recognized over your career that make a fantastic business or tech leader?
Yeah, I think willingness to problem solve, or probably addiction to problem solving is probably more what it is. Because I think if you really enjoy problem solving and just like finding the real solution and understanding the problem really well, then it doesn't matter what the problem is. So you can get really into it, whether it's commercial or technical or architectural or operational, right? And so I think that that love of problem solving, love of complexity, but also love of making things simple is really valuable. I think increasingly caring about people is something that matters. And caring about them enough to know whether you should be a manager or not. Because I think there are people who care about people and that's why they're not a manager, because they know they wouldn't be good at it. And then there are people who become managers for their own good rather than for the good of their team. And I think that's a kind of anti-pattern that you definitely see people climbing the ladder because it's there rather than because it's the right thing for them and their team. And so I think that kind of empathy and willingness and desire to lead people for their good rather than your good is something that's important. Clarity of thought and clarity of communication, and then strategic thinking, I think, is increasingly needed. That tech used to be the kind of order takers, and with the way the world has changed and how central technology now is to business, I think, and to other organizations, not just businesses, right? I think we're increasingly in a world where we can't afford to just be order takers. We can't afford to just do what we're told. We have to be part of defining what needs doing and how it needs doing. And so that really effective collaboration with product, with design, with data, with the commercial aspects of a business is increasingly important too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great answer and really kind of covers a lot of bases. I mean, I love the point you make about problem solving. Totally agree with that. And I guess I find that with problem solving as well, once you develop that mentality and that ability, it almost becomes quite a snowball effect and quite exponential, really, where you can then switch into another domain or another industry because you become quite comfortable with being uncomfortable and thinking, well, actually, I've been here before, maybe not this exact place, but I've been able to find a way and work it out. And it's just another problem to be solved. And I very often find that's a trait of really quality technology leaders, that they sort of back themselves in many ways through having solved a lot of problems over their careers to go into another one and solve that. So yeah,
And I think they're willing to go in depth as well.
Yeah.
I think some leaders who think that they can just stay at this level and operate here, and I maybe it's possible, but I've not seen many leaders I've really admired who weren't willing to go deep when they had to, and whether that's getting involved in an incident that's happening and making sure that you are able to, you're technical enough to be useful in a major incident, or that you deeply understand what the architectural proposals are that your team are making, that kind of stuff. I think that there's a conversation about T-shaped developers, being broad and then in depth in one thing. Kent Beck, I think, talked about paint drip people, where like you go deep on whatever's needed, and so you end up with this weird kind of paint drip shape to yourself, where you've got lots of weird bits of depth. It's a little like Slumdog Millionaire, right? So he'd had all these life experiences that somehow managed to give him the right answer to every single question. I think that's what the tech leadership role is like. If you're lucky, you've had an incident here and a project there and a architectural argument over at that point, and by those experiences combined, you end up with the right answer, or a good enough answer to many different things.
Yeah, I like that. I like that analogy. I've not heard that before. I wonder where my paint drips are. I'll have to think about that at some point. But I also really like the point you made about leading. Leadership is about caring for people, and I have that conversation very often with very senior technologists that are absolutely fantastic, individual contributors, and they're always thinking, should I go down that leadership route or not? And I guess I'm interested to understand from your point of view, was there a moment that you remembered that actually you thought, yeah, I will go down the leadership route? And how did you kind of make that decision that you felt it was the right time and the right direction, I suppose, for you to go in?
So some of why I've got such a strong opinion about this is I think I did it for the wrong reasons. So I went down the management track because it was the only track. So I was at P&G. When I was first at P&G, later on they introduced a kind of dual career approach. But the only way up was to become a manager. And so I became a manager very early in my career. So I was, what was I, 22, 23 or something like that. So I was my first two direct reports were older than my dad, which was a very interesting experience for all three of us. I remember them being like, oh, another young idiot manager. And I remember them taking me into a room with a problem and sitting like this with their arms folded, leaning back, blah, 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 this is what's wrong. And I went, okay, shit. So if that breaks, then this breaks too, and then we're screwed, right? And I remember them looking at each other and then like uncrossing their arms and leaning forward and solving the problem with me. But it was purely they were fed up with having these idiot new junior managers all the time. But yeah, I became a manager because it was the way up, and I've always been very ambitious and wanted to progress. And I think in retrospect, if there had been an option to stay in IC for much longer, I think I would have made a really good staff engineer, and I think I would have gone that route first. And so if I could do it all over again, I probably would stay in IC significantly longer and then only move into management later. But I do remember having the thought that if I had to be a manager, I refused to be bad at it. And I'd had a couple of bad managers and didn't want to be inflicting bad management on anybody else. And so I went looking for evidence of what great management looked like. So I found a great book called First Break All the Rules, which is based on a Gallup study that looked at like hundreds of thousands of people, went looking for high performing teams. So not happy teams, but high performing teams, and found these 12 questions that predict high performance. And I very much of my sort of management and leadership philosophy has come from understanding that, and another book called Drive, which is all about motivation at work. And basically those two combined led me to believe that our role as leaders is mostly to create space in which great work can happen. And that's about having four things: having purpose, so believing in why; autonomy, so having a say in what; mastery, being proud of how; and then inclusion, so feeling like you belong and that you can be yourself and be successful. And so that's the sort of framework that I apply now. Is I'm always thinking, does my team understand why we're doing what we're doing? Do they feel like their voices are heard? Do they feel like they're getting better as a craftsperson at what they do? And do they feel like they belong and they can succeed? And I think that's a fairly effective recipe for leading organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that's a fairly robust approach that you take, irrespective of the company, domain, sector, that you go into a situation and sort of really make sure all of those boxes are checked to get where you want to get to?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is different organizations have a different level of link to purpose. So, and different people have a different level of link to purpose. So there's some people who, if they're not saving the world or saving lives, they're not interested, right? My wife's an architect. She builds hospitals. She's literally saving lives. Going and becoming an architect who just builds houses wouldn't be as appealing to her. She's very linked to that overall purpose and the reason that she does her work. But I've also met people and managed people who, as long as they're of use to somebody, they're happy. And so the folks who are wired like that, sometimes you want to put them on your internal teams, right? Because they're so motivated by making life better for their colleagues in customer success or customer operations or finance or people team or whatever, that they're going to get, they don't need to feel like they're saving the world or saving the company or making lots of money or any of those things. They just need to feel like they're really helping somebody else's day be great. And those type of folks do really well in internal teams because they're so motivated by that kind of happiness of their colleagues. And so some of it's also about understanding how people are motivated in those different directions and then matching them to the right work. It's like when there's a anti-pattern with operational, like people who run the underlying infrastructure for technology teams. If they are too noisy success, so if they need like everybody to clap when things go right, they can become like the firefighters who become arsonists. Like they'll let things break so that they have the adrenaline of fixing them rather than doing enough fire prevention to make sure that it doesn't light on fire in the first place. And so there is something, I think, about how people are intrinsically motivated and matching that to the right type of work to make sure you don't get, accidental arsonists or people who are, in a product team that should be all about shouting about their features, but they're embarrassed or, too introverted or too quiet to want to advertise the fact that there's a great new thing that customers will benefit from. Happens more the other way than that way, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is already firmly becoming one of my favourite episodes from an analogy point of view, Mary. I'm definitely going to be stealing some of these. Hope you don't mind if you hear them coming up in any of the
totally fine.
But I will give you credit, obviously. No, cool. Yeah, totally agree with that. And I think did Dan Pink write any of those books that you mentioned though?
Yes, Dan Pink wrote Drive.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, because I've not read that, but I definitely will check both of those out. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Dan Pink as well, and I totally agree, especially on the purpose front. I think that's one of the biggest things, isn't it? And we can't assume that everybody's motivations are the same, right? Because they're not. And I think that's one of the real hallmarks of a successful manager, are people that really just actually understand what people want, right, and help them get there. So totally agree on that front. And I suppose with that in mind, you talked earlier about the role that you had in the public sector, where you were achieving ridiculous levels of scale quite quickly, but it is obviously you've worked for some huge brands, and I'm sure you've got a lot knowledge to bring to bear around how you scale technology divisions and organizations, and it's something I find it's probably one of the biggest conversations, obviously, in recruitment we have with a lot of our clients, where we're at this point, we've got a proven market fit model, we've just sort of got investment money in the bank, and now it's about how do we scale. And you find it's very often so many more parameters to think about and considerations, other than let's just go and hire 50 people and hope that they all work out. So from your perspective, how do you go about as a leader implementing a culture that you feel allows scale and I suppose sustainable scale?
Yeah, I think that there's two aspects to it. One is that you have to take your culture and your values and make them much more explicit, because I think it's easy when you're growing organically to kind of adopt people in and slowly let them see what things are like and let them conform to it or decide it's not for them. But I think when you rapidly scale, you can end up with a situation where half the team is less than 6 months in the company and they're not surrounded enough to learn by osmosis what the culture is. And so I think you have to get much more articulate, specific, and communicative about what your values are. I think values are easier to articulate than culture is. I think culture is living those values. And so I think the first thing when people scale is, if they don't stop and do that bit of work on articulating values and saying this is what we care about and this is what we don't, and this is the behavior that we need to see and this is the behavior we don't, then they end up defining culture by who they keep and who they kick out. And that's quite problematic, or just not very efficient for a start, but also quite difficult, because sometimes there are people who are effective but not a good add to the culture. And then you've got the kind of brilliant asshole trope, and you've got to decide whether you do something about it, whether you sacrifice culture for efficiency or for effectiveness. And in an ideal world, you don't want to do that. You want to find people who are effective, who also match your values. And then I think the second thing that you have to do is just get wildly better at communicating priorities and perspectives and just everything over and over and over again. People have to hear things 7 times before they really absorb them. You have to be so bored with saying what you're saying before half the organization has heard it. And I think that's the other thing that's quite a big challenge for people, is especially if you've grown organically and you've had quite a small team for quite a long time, there's a lot you get for free at that point. There's these sort of inflection points as you scale. And there's a lot that you get for free at 20 people or 50 people, where everybody knows what everybody else is doing. Nobody needs active communication to stay on task or to stay pulling in the same direction. The minute you're at 150 people, there's no way for everybody to know what everybody else is doing. And even if they did, that would not be the best investment of their time. And so at that point, you have to be much, much clearer about, this is where we're going. This is how we're going to measure success. This is why we're going this way. And then be able to trust that other people will face the same direction and pull the same way. But I think that's quite challenging, especially because so much of it comes for free when you're small. So you almost go overnight at these inflection points from having lots of people who have slowly grown to have a very cohesive culture, to then having lots of disruption to that culture and lots of unclarity because nobody's used to having to communicate or over communicate so much. And then quite a lot of organizations go through this kind of swirl moment where they're not on task, very frustrated, starting to lose parts of their culture that really matter to them, but also worried that they're never going to get it back because it just feels like it's so far away now.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really like about that answer, and I find really refreshing as well, is that, you know, you're not sort of referencing a huge amount from purely the technology perspective. It's actually about the leadership point of view and people, you know, and kind of taking people on that journey. But I totally agree with the communication, you know, the consistency, the transparency element of things. It is just, beating that drum, isn't it? Like you said, to make sure that everybody's at all times, you know, because you've got so many different, more permutations, I guess, and margins for error as you grow and scale, that having that sort of dedication to a consistent and clear message is, absolutely key.
The other thing that's a really good investment is really, really good onboarding. I think if you can get people to be independently productive in 6 weeks rather than 3 months, it makes a massive, massive difference. So getting good at documentation on onboarding doesn't sound like it's something that's going to make you go faster, but it really does. It's a real accelerator. And the other thing that I think is useful to remember from like a technical scaling point of view is that there's a lot of stuff written about what the largest companies do, and there's very few startups and scale-ups that need to do that at the startup and scale-up point. So there's no point in copying Google when you're 50 people or 150 people. Copy Google when they were 50 people. Find out what they were doing at that point. Find someone who's 6 months ahead of you, 12 months ahead of you, not someone who's 25 years ahead of you, and billions and billions in advertising revenue ahead of you. And I think that's the other thing is people look to the wrong figureheads, wrong examples. You need to look for you need to steal and reapply from places that are just a little further ahead of you rather than loads and loads ahead of you. And that's not to say that there's not a huge amount to admire about how Facebook and FANG like operate, and places like Google. It's just that you don't have the same problems they have yet.
Absolutely, yeah. Fundamentally different animals on their space. No, great point. And I also really like the point you made about onboarding as well. And I think it's something that is often overlooked. And you might think, okay, actually, what's the difference between a couple of months here or there in terms of productivity? But I guess if you're applying that whole scaling metric of, and you extrapolate that out to the number of people we're talking about, it actually makes a huge difference, especially if you're burning cash at a certain rate. So obviously have these people up and running and more productive quicker. I think that's a good point I didn't necessarily think about. Cool.
But also, if you get them productive within 6 weeks, then you've still got half of their probation period, if it's 3 months, to assess whether they're then a good cultural fit. Whereas if you spend the whole of the first 3 months getting them to be like able to do the work, then you don't have as much opportunity to be like, okay, this is how someone operates when they're independent, when they've fully onboarded. How are they doing from a values point of view? Where, because a lot of places take more than 3 months to get someone up to speed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, another great point. Okay, great. So we've kind of covered off a few areas there in your sort of 4 key metrics of how you're approaching this from a managerial point of view in terms of autonomy, mastery, purpose. And then I think the 4th one you mentioned was inclusion, which I totally also agree with as well. And again, it is obviously a hot potato at the moment in the market, especially in the tech market. I think that has been quite antiquated and quite behind the times. But obviously it's a conversation I have with a lot of clients at the moment around how they can really improve their processes and policies around DE&I. And talk to me, I know you're obviously a big advocate of this and very passionate about this particular space. So talk to me about, how do you feel about the DE&I landscape in the tech world today, and what do you feel is really important that the businesses could be doing better?
Yeah, I think there's 2 stories going on. Like, on the one hand, we've probably had the most progress over the last 10 years that we've had in any decade recently. On the other hand, you've got a lot of rhetoric, particularly in the States right now, which is backlash against DEI. You've got politicians being called DEI hires, as if that implies that they're less capable, rather than the reality, which is you have to be more capable to be seen as equal if you're from an underrepresented group, right? And so there's this big backlash going on. There's a lot of companies that are showing that they didn't really believe in DEI because they're pulling back from it now that there's risk of public opinion being not as positive as it used to be. You're seeing people pull out of supporting Pride. You're seeing people stop supporting, people of color groups and things like that, which is very unfortunate, I think. But I think, I fundamentally believe that the data shows diverse teams win. They're more innovative. They're more likely to get patents. They're more likely to be profitable. If you've got good gender diversity, you outperform your competition by 15%. If you've got good racial diversity, it's 35%. It's really significant to really harness that impact. But one of the challenges is that as diversity goes up, inclusion goes down, because it's very easy to feel included if you're amongst people who are very like you, and the more different the set of people around you becomes, the less likely you are to feel included. And so I think that's where the hard work starts, is to take a group of people who are genuinely different from each other and create such a collaborative atmosphere that they come to the right shared decision about what to do, which also makes you more dependent on data, by the way, which is, I think, again, a reason that it's a success mode. And then you also have to make sure that you're doing the hard work to make that inclusion happen. So you bring these different people together, but then you've got to make it so that they can actually contribute. And I think people are asking themselves sort of 3 questions when they're deciding whether to join somewhere, stay somewhere, take a promotion, or leave. Right? They're thinking, am I expected here? Is there someone like me even expected to be here? Am I respected here? Are my differences seen as a feature or a bug? And then, can I be myself and be successful here? And I think that last one is the most important one, is whether you can be yourself and be successful, or whether you have to spend a lot of time, what people of color tend to call it is code switching, or white voice is something that's talked about a lot. Autism, we talk about it as masking. But yeah, there's this reality that if you have to spend a lot of energy pretending to be something that you're not, pretending to fit in, it takes away from the energy you could otherwise spend on your work. So Stonewall about 15 years ago did some research, found that people could be 40% more effective more productive if they could be themselves at work. And that's huge. Wouldn't you take 2 extra days of productivity any day of any week, right? And all you have to do is make it so that people don't have to lie about what they did at the weekend and who their partner is. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of people spend their time on the am I expected, am I respected? They spend it on the, attracting you into the company, making sure your interview process is unbiased. But actually the huge amount of work that's needed is to make it so that you are actually able to succeed as yourself once you're in.
Yeah.
And I think that most companies should be working on that first before they get the right to attract people who are different into the company. But it's quite difficult to make that change happen without actual people from different backgrounds in the company, right? How do you do bias training and unbias your organization and your processes when there's nobody from that group in there to say what would be good for them? And so I think it's tough. There's a lot of organizations that put far too much pressure on the people who are from underrepresented groups to fix everything around them, when in reality it's the majority that needs to fix their behavior, not the minority, right?
Absolutely. So do you feel, in terms of kind of real world applicable advice that companies can take on board, very often it is an educational issue that people just haven't been educated and aren't aware necessarily of the right way to go about it?
Yes. And I think there's a mix of education and empathy. So some of it is, what do you need to know about these different groups and what their experiences are, and how they tend to be discriminated against, how they tend to be stereotyped or talked down to, or those kind of things. And then some of it is just going, well, now that I understand what it's like to be a teetotal Muslim person who's very devout, now I've got to put my empathy hat on and go, shit, if I've got a full day meeting during Ramadan, then that's going to be really tough on somebody who's, fasting at the same time. If I've got an interview process that's 7 hours in a row and somebody needs to go pray, or they have a physical disability and they need a rest in between interviews, or they're dyslexic, and so asking them to do multiple written tests in one day with no extra time is really challenging. Like, I think that first comes the understanding, and then comes the application of empathy to really go, with all of these different lenses, how do we accommodate best?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a fascinating space, and like I say, the encouraging thing is that it really feels like we are taking big steps forward, and even in my 16 years of doing this job, it feels like taking a gargantuan leap forward in the last 5 years, I suppose. And I think a lot of that is around shedding light on it, raising awareness, and educating in the right way. Like I say, still a hell of a amount of work to do, absolutely, but at least it's feels like the needle is moving, which is great. And I suppose, taking that into account, if we sort of take the DE&I piece off the table, and not necessarily think about gender or race or the kind of characteristics, but are there any particular personality traits, characteristics that you would look for as a core thread of somebody coming into a team, irrespective of role, technological, proficiency, etc.? How do you evaluate the kind of the traits and characteristics of people coming in that you
the intangibles? I think that, like, being a self-starter, being willing to figure out what needs doing and get it done is a trait that's independent of all those other aspects of diversity. I think anybody can show that. I think leadership shows up in different ways for different groups. And so I think being able to see that somebody might lead in a different way if they're from a particular group, like women are much more likely to lead in a collaborative fashion, because bluntly, people don't react well when we're bossy. We get called bossy rather than strong when we're directive, right? And so I think that's the thing to be aware of, is how do different traits show up differently for different depending on what background and group and everything else like that you're from. But I think clear comms, ability to self-start, willingness to lead, but also willingness to follow when appropriate. Like people who insist on being the leader all the time are a challenge in a different way. And then that problem-solving skill. I think all of those are sort of universal things that are quite good. When I was at P&G, they used to talk about power of the mind, power of the power of people, and power of change. And so they were broadly looking for people who were intellectually at the right level, people who had the people skills to. There's a famous quote where the CHRO said that P&G hires the most competitive people they can find and then only rewards them for collaborating, which I think is a lovely summary of what the culture there was like. And then power of change was all about the fact that it was a continuous improvement environment. And so you needed to find the people, when they were first, second year students as interns, you needed to find people who were unwilling to put up with things being bad. So you wanted to find folks who were going to spot something was wrong in their degree course and go to the administration and say, hey, it would be really good if we had some coaching and tutoring for the people who come to computer science without maths A level, for instance, right? Or those kind of things. And so you're looking for that willingness to make change happen, willingness to use data to do it, and then the people skills to actually collaborate with others whilst making change effective.
Yeah, nice. And I guess just as an overriding observation, I think from our conversation so far, I mean, you strike me as someone that's incredibly self-aware and kind of care about doing a really good job and being the best leader you can be. And I think often we don't talk about the challenges, I suppose, that we've faced. We often just see this kind of finished article of somebody that's very polished, that spent a lot of time working on themselves. But what would you say have been some of your biggest challenges that you faced along the way that you weren't necessarily expecting as part of your journey, and how did you go about overcoming those?
Yeah, I think at some of the more traditional companies I was at, the bigger companies I was at, it was mostly my own frustration with how slow things were, and needing to learn that me getting frustrated at it wasn't going to make it better, and how to actually make change happen. So I read a lot of like John Cotter's books and things like that about how you actually affect change and how you need to bring people on the journey with you. And I think early in my career, I was just frustrated and angry about things being so slow and then not very good at bringing anybody on the journey with me. And so I learned, got a lot of feedback on it and learned a lot from people who were better at that kind of influencing than I was early on in my career. And then I think at GDS, when I had 80 direct reports, I was doing 80 one-to-ones a month. That was a very intense time.
Anything else? How do you balance it? Anything else?
Not much else, no. Just lots of trying to do the one-to-ones, follow up from the one-to-ones, and everything else in my job was it was a lot of 100-hour weeks. But it was a good time. But it was very, very hectic and a huge amount of pressure to get Gov UK live on time to budget and those kind of things, because we were essentially proving that agile ways of working could work for government as well, and that proper service design and proper product management would make a real difference, and so would proper design and good engineering. And so a lot of my challenge at GDS was unlearning everything I'd learned at P&G about how to get things done, and then learning a new way and a much more modern way of how to get things done. And then my other major challenge was when I was at Monzo. I broke. I had not realized I was autistic and ADHD. I gave up coffee for 6 months and realized only in retrospect that I had been self-medicating with caffeine in a really, really significant way. So I used to be a kind of 7 or 8 double espresso coffees a day kind of person. And then I gave up coffee because I wasn't sleeping well, and I became unproductive. And it was the first time I'd ever not been able to get things done in my whole life, and it broke me. I ended up at one point sent home from work for a week, which had never happened to me before, and then ended up needing to find a doctor, and then eventually got diagnosed with autism and ADHD, and I'm now medicated for the ADHD and understand myself a lot better in terms of the autism. But yeah, there was there was definitely a time when I was at Monzo where I wasn't myself, and it really showed, and it was really negative. And I don't think I ever really recovered from that in that role. It was incredibly difficult. But that was much more on the kind of knowing yourself and adapting to who you really are kind of side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that, and really brave of you to kind of talk about it. And I think it's really important that you are able to talk about those kind of adversities where because not take anything away from obviously your personal situation there, but I think we all go through those periods where we don't feel like we're ourselves, right? And it's really important to recognize what to do about that. And I think very often it is about being in the right company that allows you to do something about that, because very often there are cultures, probably more draconian businesses of the olden day, where if you're off your game at all for any way, shape and form, they're not really bothered about why. They're just bothered about the get back on it and do something about it. So what advice would you give to people that possibly find that they're in that situation where they have maybe not identifying with the person they are now as to who they were before, and need to do something about it? What would you say to them?
I mean, I think be open with who you can be, that something's wrong. Look for help and try to take help, which is sometimes very difficult. But yeah, I needed professional help, and that's not something I'm ashamed of. I think it was very necessary at the time. I think if I'd realized what was wrong and that something was wrong earlier and asked for help earlier, then I would have done better in that situation. I'm super grateful to Jonas, who was the founding CTO at Monzo, because he was very understanding and tried very hard to help me recover. But it was tough to admit that there was that big a problem.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And it's just a stark reminder, I guess, that people in those similar situations, their experience is going to be largely down to good or bad leadership, really, as to how well they are able to get through those situations and get back on the horse. So I think that's a really great example to talk about. Okay, well, let's sort of talk a little bit about the world today. Obviously, we're entering into. So I'm really impressed with, Meri, that we've done a whole podcast, and so far we haven't talked about AI. I mean, that's got to be. I mean, how far into this are we? I think you've won the medal on that. But and I'm not saying we have to talk about AI now, but thinking about the world of technology moving forwards, I love the fact that a lot of what we've spoken about today has been about leadership, your approach, and I can see why you've been such a successful leader to date as a result of that. But really interested to understand a bit more about your thoughts on the world of tech, where we are today, and really what are you most excited about, in the world of technology moving forward.
I mean, I'm always most excited by how we can make a difference for users. So I think taking whatever the latest tech advancements are and turning them into something that's a great user experience, I think is really exciting and interesting. So I am excited about AI to the extent that it's going to be useful for people. So we're trying at PLEO to avoid what a few companies have done, which is just sort of like slap ChatGPT on it and hope, which is not a product strategy in my view. I mean, it's very lucrative for OpenAI if that's what everybody's doing, but it's not really a product strategy. And so we're trying really hard to figure out how is this genuinely useful for people, and what things do people are they willing to trust AI on. So for instance, we in our product, we don't we will try to detect what date something was and what the amount was, and who the vendor was, and we'll try and capture all of that as much as we can from the receipt that you put in, or from the surrounding information that we've got about the spend that you've made on your card. But it's all suggestions that a human then goes, yes, that's right, yes, that's right, yes, that's right. And we just quite firmly believe that that's easier for people to have the suggestion and be able to just tap it to say yes, than it is to get it wrong and then force them to correct it, and then worry about whether it's going to have to be corrected all the time. Because that's bluntly been our experience with, smart features in our phones and similar. How many times have I had to teach my phone that I'm trying to say fuck, not duck? I don't trust that it learns. And I think people are quite the same about AI generally at the moment. Like we're willing to try it if it's useful, but it needs to prove that usefulness. And I think it's super interesting. I also think there's an interesting thing happening right now where everybody wants to do everything with Gen AI, and it's often much cheaper and better to do it with traditional ML. And so that's the other thing that we're focused on is every time we try something with Gen AI, we also try it with traditional ML. We figure out which one's the actual better model, because ML is often much cheaper to run than Gen AI as well. And that also helps your customers, because if you're, putting things in that are very expensive for them, then it has to be really, really valuable. And so we're always, checking the different ways that we can do things and making sure that we're really investing the right way. And then I think the other thing that's really interesting in the tech world right now is platform engineering. So we've hit this point where there's so much good abstraction in the cloud providers that you don't have to be worrying about, tin in the same way that you used to be. Like for a long time, we used the cloud in a way which was just like, it was just somebody else's server, and we communicated with it over the internet rather than just through a data center, right? And I think now we've got much better abstractions, and then we've got the ability for our infrastructure teams and our developer experience teams to build really, really good user experiences for our engineers internally as well. And so things like design systems and developer experience, we've got a series of teams at PLEO called Mobile Core, Web Core, and Backend Core, and they basically figure out all the things that framework-wise would make development faster and easier for the product teams. And I think that kind of platform engineering, what's the right abstraction, what's the right way to invest internally to make your development speed better and your end product higher quality. I think that's also really interesting. Camille Fournier has just written a great book about it. Sarah Wells has written a book recently about microservices and how to succeed running microservices at scale. And they're both, they're what I'm reading at the moment.
Cool.
Because that's what's interesting from a tech perspective right now.
Perfect. I'll check those out. You've also given me some amazing book suggestions this podcast as well, so thanks for that. But no, certainly, really microservices at scale is something that obviously a lot of our clients are very much on that journey with. So I totally would agree with you there. But I love the point that you make about actually it's about solving more problems for users, and I think that's so true. Whereas a lot of people think, how can we fit this Gen AI thing onto absolutely everything that needs it can go on, and actually it's very often not the right approach, not the most elegant approach, and certainly not the cheapest and most efficient approach as well, right? And it's actually looking at what is the problem we're trying to solve, and let's work it backwards from there versus let's try and retrofit Gen AI into any problem that really doesn't need it. And I think there's been a few examples where it's really not paid off. So I totally would agree.
One really good example actually is Incident.io. They've built some Gen AI features which are really cool, where they basically track in your incident channel all the conversation that's happening, and then at the end they can suggest actions that you might not have thought of that would make it better the next time, and they're surprisingly good suggestions. So they're one company that I really admire how they've utilized Gen AI.
Yeah, nice. I mean, don't get me wrong, I totally agree with it. It is nice when you hear of a genuine use case and you're like, actually that's a perfect suggestion of how Gen AI can be used. And like I say, a lot of companies doing it very well, but it doesn't mean every company needs to throw it at everything. So yeah, totally agree with you on that one. Okay, fantastic. Look, Meri, I've really enjoyed the chat today. I think you've shed a huge amount of value with us all. So thank you again for doing that. And I like to end every podcast, you may know by now, with the same question, which I stole from Rich Reed, who wrote a book called "If I Could Tell You One Thing," went around a load of famous people and asked them for their one favorite piece of advice. And I'm going to do the same for you. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, what's your favorite piece of advice that you've ever received throughout your personal life, your career, whatever it may be, that you care to pass on to your fellow humankind?
The best advice I ever received was career advice, which was figure out what you can't stop yourself from doing. Because a lot of the career advice is like, what do you love? What are you best at? And I tend to find that anything I'm good at, I'm willing to love, right? So it's not super helpful for me to try and determine my future based on what I love, because it changes so much, and I have found that is the case over time. But figuring out what you care about so much you won't let anybody else do it that's really helpful for figuring out what route you should take. And actually, that was what led me to realize that though I went into management for the wrong reasons, I stayed for the right reasons, because I think I'm suck at letting other people do the people stuff because I'm worried that it won't be done well. And there's a trust thing there and all that kind of stuff. But I really enjoy working on systems that make things better for people. Like whether that's processes or tech or ways of working or whatever else. But yeah, figuring out what you can't stop yourself doing is the best advice I ever got.
I like that. I like that. And I think, you know, rather encouragingly across both of those things you mentioned there, the core thread, I think, is about actually just caring for people, isn't it? You know, whether it's from a management point of view or building systems point of view, it's actually helping people, solving problems. And yeah, I think that's a lovely way to end. So yeah, not a lot else remains but to say thank you again for coming on. And please do keep us posted of your all your revelations and come back and have another chat with us at some point in future. We'd love to speak to you again.
Would love to. Thanks very much for having me.